The dog wouldn't stop whimpering. That was the first thing Sergeant Lila Hartman noticed when she stepped out of the Veterans Outpatient Wing at CFB, Petawawa's attached medical center. Not the cold February air cutting across the parking lot. Not the sound of boots on salt-crusted pavement. Not even the man standing too still beside the blue pickup truck near the far fence. She noticed the dog first, a Belgian Malinois, maybe 4 years old, wearing a service vest that had seen better days. The dog was pressed low against the side of a man's leg, ears flat, whimpering in that particular way animals do when they know something is wrong before any human has figured it out. Lila had spent 6 years in the Canadian Forces, 2 of them forward deployed as a combat medic in Mali and later in Latvia. She had learned to trust that kind of signal. An animal that scared for no visible reason usually meant there was a very visible reason. You just hadn't found it yet. She pulled her jacket tighter and kept walking toward her car. It was a Tuesday. She had a 14-hour shift behind her. Her feet hurt in a way that started in her heels and ended somewhere around the base of her skull. And she had a casserole in her freezer she'd been promising herself since Monday morning. The dog whimpered again. Lila stopped. The man holding the leash was Corporal Eric Dufresne. She recognized him from the physiotherapy waiting room where she'd walked past a dozen times over the past 2 weeks. Mid-40s, right leg prosthetic below the knee. Retired after an IED in Kandahar that had taken 3 members of his unit and left him with a titanium rod and a decade of nightmares. She knew his file the way you know a patient's file when you've been treating people long enough. The shape of the grief before you ever read the diagnosis. He came every Tuesday. The dog, whose name was Boomer, was his service animal, certified and registered. The only reason Dufresne had told his intake counselor he still bothered to set an alarm in the morning. Boomer was not whimpering at Dufresne. Boomer was whimpering at the man by the blue truck. She clocked him the same moment the dog went rigid. Late 30s, heavy jacket, baseball cap pulled low. He was close to the fence, maybe 12 meters from Dufresne, and he was not walking toward his vehicle. He was watching, and the watching had a quality to it that Lila recognized from 2 deployments. The kind of stillness that isn't peace but preparation. She didn't make a decision exactly. That's the part that would be hard to explain afterward, in the hospital room, when people kept asking what she was thinking. She wasn't thinking. Her body just moved, the way it had been trained to move in triage when the call comes in, and there's no time to deliberate. You assess, you act, you adapt. She was still 10 meters from Dufresne when the man by the truck broke into motion. He had something in his right hand. She saw the glint before she understood what it was. Dufresne saw it too, but his reaction time was slowed by 18 months of civilian life and a right leg that didn't flex the way it used to. And Boomer was pulling hard on the leash now, not toward the man but sideways, trying to pull Dufresne out of the trajectory the way a trained dog does when it can't fight a threat it can redirect a handler away from. Lila ran. She didn't yell. Yelling takes oxygen, and she needed oxygen. She closed the distance in a few seconds that felt like nothing, like a collapse of time. And she stepped in front of Dufresne and Boomer a half second before the man reached them. She felt the first blow before she processed that it was a knife. The pain arrived not as pain but as pressure. A deep, wrong pressure below her left ribs, on the right side of her neck, twice along her left forearm where she'd thrown it up on instinct. She was still on her feet. She didn't know how. She had both hands on the man's jacket, and she held on, which is what you do when you're losing blood in the field and falling means the casualty behind you is exposed. You hold on. You hold the line. You give the people behind you the seconds they need. Boomer got free. The leash must have slipped from Dufresne's hand. Or maybe Dufresne released it deliberately. She would never know for certain. But Boomer came around Lila's left side in a low arc, the way trained Malinois do, and hit the man's knife arm at the wrist with the full force of 40 kilograms of muscle and instinct and trained fury. The knife skittered across the pavement. The man went down. Boomer stood over him and did not move. Lila sat down on the asphalt. She didn't intend to. Her legs made the decision without consulting her. She remembers Dufresne's face above her. She remembers him pressing both hands against her side and saying something she couldn't quite hear over the ringing that had started in her ears. She remembers thinking, distantly, the way you think of small, irrelevant things when your body is in shock. I left my phone in my jacket pocket. It's going to get blood on it. And then she remembers thinking of her mother in Sudbury, who had worried every single day Lila was deployed and had finally stopped worrying when she came home. Her mother was going to have words about this. She heard sirens. Somewhere behind her, Boomer was still standing over the man on the ground, perfectly still, not growling, just standing. That was the last thing she saw before the ambulance lights blurred into each other and became nothing. She woke up in the Civic Hospital in Ottawa, which meant they had moved her during the night. She would learn later that the initial stabilization had been done at the Petawawa Base Medical Center, that she had received 2 units of blood in the emergency bay, that the attending surgeon, a small, precise woman named Dr. Orla Fenn, had described the injury to Lila's left forearm as aggressive but survivable, and the 2 torso wounds as serious, clean, and lucky, in the way that only a person with a very high pain threshold and a very stubborn refusal to fall down can be lucky. Lila had been stabbed 5 times, 2 in the torso, 2 in the left forearm, 1 glancing, cut along the left side of her neck that had bled dramatically, but missed everything that mattered by less than a centimeter. She didn't know any of this when she woke up. She knew that the light in the room was the particular greenish white of hospital fluorescence, that her left arm was bandaged from wrist to elbow, that something was pulling at the skin of her neck, and that there was a man sitting in the chair beside her bed who was asleep with his forehead resting on the edge of the mattress. It was Dufresne. His hand was resting on the bed rail, and on the floor beside his prosthetic leg was Boomer, lying with his chin on his paws, eyes open, watching the door. Lila looked at the dog for a long moment. "Hey," she said. Her voice came out like gravel. Dufresne woke up so fast his shoulder hit the bed rail, and he swore quietly in French before he registered where he was and what he was looking at. Hartman. He said her name the way people say a name when they've been rehearsing it in the dark for hours, as a kind of small proof that things are still real. "How long?" she said. 17 hours. She looked at the window. It was dark outside. They let Boomer in? Dufresne looked at the dog. Something complicated moved across his face. "I told them he was a service animal. They said the policy was..." He stopped. He wouldn't leave the hallway outside the surgery. He sat there for 4 hours and wouldn't move. Eventually, someone found me in the waiting room and said, "Fine, as long as he's quiet." He's been quiet. Lila looked at the dog again. Boomer's tail moved once, slowly, against the floor. "He did good," she said. "You did good," Dufresne said. There was something in his voice she didn't know what to do with, so she didn't do anything with it. "Is the guy in custody?" "Arrested at the scene." I stayed until the RCMP got there. He paused. He had a prior. Had been following veteran service animals for weeks, apparently. Animal rights thing, wrong and violent kind. Boomer was the third time he'd tried something. His jaw moved. You were the first time someone stepped in front of it. Leela absorbed this. She looked at the ceiling. What's today? Wednesday. Late Wednesday. I had a casserole, she said. Dufresne blinked. Sorry, in my freezer. I was going to have it Tuesday night. He stared at her for a moment. Then something released in his face and he laughed. Not loud, just a small, exhausted sound that was better than nothing. I'll make sure it's still there when you get home. She closed her eyes. She was tired in the specific way she'd only ever felt after the really bad calls. The ones where the math of survival had been close enough that you could feel the decimal places. She was also, underneath the tiredness and the pain and the low hum of whatever they'd put in her IV, something else. Something quieter, not fine exactly, but intact. She slept. She didn't know about it until Thursday afternoon, when her nurse, a young man with a Newfoundland accent and an expression of barely contained news, came into her room with the blood pressure cuff and the kind of barely suppressed excitement that people have when they are technically not supposed to tell you something but absolutely will. If you ask the right question, she asked, he told her. Outside CFB Petawawa's main gate on Thursday morning, the vehicles had begun arriving before 7. Not military vehicles, personal trucks, cars, a few motorcycles despite the February cold. They came from Petawawa, from Pembroke, from Trenton, and Kingston and Ottawa. Some had driven through the night. By 9 in the morning, the access road leading to Civic Hospital in Ottawa had a lineup of vehicles that stretched 3 city blocks, and the people in those vehicles were wearing regimental colors, unit patches, rank insignia that spanned 2 decades of Canadian Armed Forces service. More than 300 of them. They had not been organized by anyone official. There had been no memo, no chain of command, no order issued. A message had moved through veterans' networks and serving member group chats with the stripped-down efficiency of military communication. Medic in Ottawa Civic. Combat vet stepped in front of a knife to protect a service animal and a veteran. Room 412. Thursday morning. That was all it said. They came anyway. The hospital administration had called the Ottawa Police Service at 7:30 in something close to a panic, expecting a crowd management situation. The officer who arrived looked at the lineup of people standing quietly in the February cold, not blocking anything, not shouting, just standing. The way people who have spent years learning the discipline of presence stand, and called it in as not requiring a response. The duty supervisor agreed. They stood down. By the time Lila's nurse told her what was happening outside, there were veterans lined along the hallway of the 4th floor as well. People who had badges and passes and enough gentle persistence with the front desk to have made it inside. They were not asking for anything. They were simply there. Lila's nurse offered to bring her to the window. She said she could walk. He looked at her chart, and the look on his face said this was not medically advisable. And she said she'd done worse on worse days, and he got her a wheelchair, which was the compromise. The window at the end of the 4th floor hallway faced the street. She looked down. She had been in the forces long enough that crowds of veterans didn't usually affect her. She'd stood at too many memorials, attended too many funerals, shaken too many hands at too many unit functions where you held yourself together and represented and kept it professional. She knew how to be in those moments without being undone by them. But this was not a funeral, Nobody was holding it together for anyone else. These were people who had gotten into their vehicles on a Wednesday night in February, because someone had told them that a woman they didn't know had stood in front of a knife for a man they didn't know and a dog, and that the woman was going to live, and that she was 40 minutes down the highway. That was enough. That was the whole reason. Dufresne was behind her. He had come back again that morning, which she hadn't asked him to do and hadn't told him not to. He had brought coffee from the Tim Hortons on the ground floor, which she wasn't supposed to have yet, but had anyway. He was standing in the hallway now with Boomer sitting at his heel, and when Lila looked back at him, the dog was looking up at her. She turned back to the window. She had not cried in 17 years. That was not entirely true, but it was true enough that it surprised her when she felt the pressure behind her eyes. Not grief exactly, not pain. Something harder to name. Something that had to do with looking down at 300 people standing in the cold for no reason except that it was the right thing to do, and understanding at 41 stories of altitude in a military career that this was actually what it had all been about. Not the deployments, not the citations, not the dress uniform she kept in a dry cleaning bag at the back of her closet. This, the specific, stubborn, unglamorous fact that some people, when they are needed, step forward, and other people, when they witness it, remember. She didn't cry, but it was a near thing. One of the veterans in the hallway, an older man, gray at the temples, a Princess Patricia's cap badge on his jacket, caught her eye as she turned the wheelchair back toward her room. He didn't say anything. He nodded. Once, with a formality that was not cold but precise, the way you acknowledge a colleague across a room when words would be insufficient and unnecessary. She nodded back. The man who had attacked her was charged on Friday with 2 counts of aggravated assault, 1 count of criminal harassment, possession of a weapon for a dangerous purpose, and 3 additional charges related to the earlier incidents involving service animals. He was held without bail. His case was assigned to an Ottawa Crown attorney and would not go to trial for 14 months. But the outcome, when it came, would carry a sentence that satisfied almost everyone who had been following it. Lila didn't follow it closely. She had enough to keep her occupied. She was discharged on the following Monday, which Dr. Fenn had initially resisted and ultimately permitted with a list of conditions that Lila received in the same spirit she had always received operating parameters, with full intention of respecting them until the situation on the ground required otherwise. Her left arm would need physiotherapy for 3 months. The torso wounds had healed cleaner than expected. The neck cut was already fading. Her mother drove up from Sudbury. She arrived Tuesday morning with a bag of groceries, a second bag that turned out to contain a new casserole dish. Yours is old, Leela, and glass chips, and the expression of a woman who had rehearsed a very reasonable and composed response to finding out her daughter had been stabbed and had now abandoned the rehearsal entirely in favor of standing in the hospital discharge lounge and holding Lila's face in both hands for longer than was strictly necessary. Lila let her. Her mother had a lot of questions. Lila answered the ones she could. Her mother met Dufresne in the parking lot, where he had come to help carry bags to the car, which had not been requested and which Lila had not told him not to do. And her mother shook his hand and said, "Thank you for staying." And Dufresne said she stayed for my dog, and her mother said, "I know," in a way that suggested she was holding several things in her chest that she was choosing not to say out loud, which was a very Sudbury way of handling strong emotion. Boomer pressed his face against Lila's hip the entire time she was in the parking lot. Dufresne said the dog had been doing that since Tuesday, that the first time a handler brought him back to his apartment after the attack, Boomer had gone directly to the door and sat down and refused to move until Dufresne took him back to the hospital. That this had happened twice. That the therapy coordinator had told Dufresne this was not typical service animal behavior, and Dufresne had said he was aware of that. Thanks. Lila scratched behind Boomer's ear. You're going to be insufferable now, she told him. Just so you know. Boomer wagged his tail. She went back to work 8 weeks later, which was 3 weeks earlier than the return-to-work plan had specified. Dr. Fenn had opinions about this. Lila had opinions about this in the opposite direction. They compromised on modified duties for the first 2 weeks, which meant triage intake and consults and the kind of floor rounds that didn't require her to lift with her left arm. The other nurses on the ward had placed, without any discussion and without telling her until she found it, a small framed thing on the nursing station bulletin board. Not a commendation. Nothing official, just a photograph someone had taken from the street on that Thursday morning. The long line of people in the February cold, stretching down the block, the Civic Hospital sign visible at the far end. No names, no caption, just the photograph. She stood there and looked at it for a while. Then she put her stethoscope on and went to work. There are things that don't show up in the discharge summary. They don't show up in the official account, or the news coverage, or the charge sheet, or the physiotherapy notes. They live in the specific granular texture of days that come after. The fact that Dufresne brought her casserole to the hospital when she got out of surgery, and that she ate it cold from the container in bed on Friday morning, while her mother slept on the fold-out chair, and that it was, genuinely, the best thing she had ever tasted. The fact that Boomer visited 3 more times during her recovery, always brought by Dufresne, who always found reasons why he happened to be in Ottawa that week anyway, reasons that became less plausible as February became March. And the reasons became thin enough that Lila stopped pretending to believe them, and he stopped offering them, and they both found this to be a reasonable arrangement. The fact that the Princess Patricia's man from the hallway sent a card, not a military card, not a formal card, a simple one, white with a red maple leaf, the kind you can buy at any drugstore in the country. Inside, in the careful handwriting of someone who had learned to write formally and never quite let it go, we don't always get to choose the moment, but we get to choose the answer. You chose well. No name. She didn't need one. The fact that she went back up the parking lot at Pettifoss 6 weeks after the attack on a Tuesday, at the same time she had been leaving her shift. She stood in the spot. She didn't know exactly why. She stood there until the cold got into her jacket, and then she went back inside and got a coffee and sat in the waiting room outside physiotherapy, the same waiting room she'd been walking past for 2 weeks when she first noticed Dufresne. She thought about the moment, not the fear of it. She hadn't been afraid, there hadn't been time, but the shape of it. The way something had moved in her body before her mind had weighed anything. She had spent a long time in her career being trained to respond to signals, to read threat environments, to act before thinking catches up. She had always told herself that was professional training, muscle memory, protocol. She wasn't sure anymore. That was all it was. There are people who spend their whole lives waiting for the moment that asks something real of them. And there are people who don't wait, exactly, who just keep showing up, shift after shift, Tuesday after Tuesday, in parking lots and surgical bays and forward operating bases and hospital hallways until the moment arrives and the body already knows what to do. She finished her coffee. She went back inside. That was the job. It had always been the job. And in the particular February of her 41st year, standing in a cold parking lot in Petawawa with 5 new scars, and a dog that had decided she was worth following to Ottawa twice, Lila Hartman understood that she would keep showing up for it. Not because she was brave, or because she was fearless, or because she fit some story someone wanted to tell about nurses and veterans and service dogs, but because somewhere in the long arc of a career built from other people's worst days, she had become someone who didn't know how to do anything else, and standing in a parking lot in February, with the cold coming in off the Ottawa River and the light going the pale gold it goes just before dark, that felt, quietly, like enough.